We are on DAF Daled Amid Aleph, and we're learning about a machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, who argue, everyone agrees to the halacha that a Kohen Gadol has to be sequestered for 7 days before Yom Kippur. The machlokas is, what is the source for this? Rabbi Yochanan says, like we've been learning all along in the Gemara, that we learn it out from the Miluim, that the 7 preparatory days before the first day of Avoda of the Mishkan on the 1st of Nisan, and Reish Lakish learns it out from Maimed Har Sinai, that Moshe was sequestered for 6 days, and on the 7th day he was called into the Machane Shechina, into this divine cloud, to receive the rest of the Torah. So now the Gemara is going to tell us, or it's about the 10th line or so on Daf Daled Amud Aleph, Tanya Kavase de Rabbi Yochanan, Tanya Kavase de Reish Lakish. We have a brisa to support both Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Tanya Kavase de Rabbi Yochanan. Here's the brisa that supports Rabbi Yochanan, who says we learn it out from the Miluim. It says, Bezos Yavo Aron El HaKodesh. The Torah talks about the Yom Kippur Avoda, and it says, Bezos. With this, Aharon shall come into the holiness. And Rashi points out that the word Bezos means with something that we've learned about previously in the Torah. And that's the way the Gemara says, B'masha Amr B'inyan, something that was mentioned previously in the same context. Maihi, what is that? B'inyan and Demiluim. It's about the Miluim. Uma Omer B'inyan HaMiluim, Aharon Pirei Shiva V'Shimesh Yom Echad, Umoshe Moser Lo Kol Shiva Kedei Lechancha Ba'avoda. That Aaron was sequestered for 7 days. He served for 1 day. During those 7 days, Moshe gave him all of the instructions that he needed to do the avoda. Be'af l'doros Kohen Gadol Parei Shiva u'mishamesh Yom Echad u'shnei talmidei chachamim mitalmidav shel Moshe. So too in all generations, the Kohen Gadol is sequestered for 7 days. He serves for 1 day on Yom Kippur, and during that 7-day period, 2 talmidei chachamim from the students of Moshe. Now, la'afuke tzedukim, to exclude the Sadducees. You see, there's a polemical aspect to this brisa. This, of course, brisa is being taught at a time when there's a power struggle between the Tzedukim and the Prushim as to who's going to control the kahuna in the Beis HaMikdash. And so therefore it's la'afuke tzedukim. If you're not a Prushi, if you don't really believe in Torah Sheba'al Peh, you're not mitalmid of Shel Moshe. And Mosen lo kol shiva kedei lechancho ba'avoda. They give him all of the instructions for 7 days in order that he should know what to do for the avoda. And mikan amru shivas yomim kodem yom kippur mafrishin kohen gadol min beiso lelishkas parhedrin. And from here we learn that the Mishnah says that for 7 days we sequester the kohen gadol from his house and put him in the Lishkas Parhedrin, which is that chamber in the Beis HaMikdash. Ucheshem shem hafrishin kohen gadol, kach mafrishin kohen asarif es hapor l'lishka shal pnei habira tzafona mizracha. And just like we sequester the kohen gadol before Yom Kippur, we also sequester the kohen who's going to be in charge of doing the Para Aduma service. And if you remember, according to Rabbi Yochanan, that's not derived explicitly from Scripture, but rather it's derived it's a rabbinical ordinance that's just an asmachta, and we said it's because of Maila Ba'alma, that it was a special chumrah that we placed on the laws of Paraduma. And they placed this fellow, who's preparing the Paraduma, into a special lishka that is in the northeast corner of the temple.
The names for some clerk, Roman clerk.
What is
name?
Who?
Sanhedrin.
Oh, well, we're going to see later on. The Gemara is going to tell us. Okay, we haven't yet defined it. And both for the Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur and the Kohen who's going to prepare the Paraduma for during those 7 days, we sprinkle him each day with the water of the Paraduma from all of the Paradumas that had been prepared historically, going all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu. V'im Toimar, and then the brisa continues and it says, maybe it's not really comparable because b'miluim dam and hachamayim. By the miluim, the sprinkling was blood. The kohanim were sprinkled during the yimei hamiluim with sacrificial blood, and here they're sprinkled with water of the paraduma. So amar tnichnasu mayim tachas dam. So the answer is that since the time of the miluim, the water of the paraduma is employed as a surrogate for the sacrificial blood to inaugurate the kohanim. And then the brisa continues and it says, Va'omer, and furthermore, another connection between the Miluim and Yom Kippur is as follows. Ka'asher asa bayom hazeh tziva Hashem la'asos lechaper aleichem. as just like He did on this day, God commanded to do to atone for you. This is a pasuk by the Miluim, and what we learn from these two verbs of lasos and lechaper is lasos elu masei para, lechaper elu masei yom hakippurim. That lasos refers to the connection to the paraduma, that just like you sequester by the Miluim, so too you sequester by the paraduma, and lechaper is to connect to Yom Kippur, as we've learned all along. Now, that's the conclusion of the Brisa. A short analysis of the Brisa, where the Gemara is going to question certain things. V'hai bezos miboy le'legufe v'par ben bakar lechatas v'ayel la'ola. You started off by telling me that the word bezos is coming to connect the Miluim to Yom Kippur. You said that the word bezos mentioned in the context of Yom Kippur teaches me that with this means with this that had been taught previously. So the Gemara says, but bezos is coming legufe, it's coming to teach for itself. It's coming to tell me that in the pasuk it says that Aaron must bring a par for a chatos and an ayil for an ola, a bull for a chatos offering, a ram for an ola offering. And that's what the word bezos is coming to teach. With this, in other words, he cannot come into the Kodesh HaKadoshim unless he does this protocol. So why? How can you tell me that the word bezos is coming to refer to the Miluim when it's clearly coming to refer to something that's contained within the pasuk itself? So Amri ila karben lechude lemakra bazeh o be'ela my bezos shamas mina tarti. Answers the Gemara as follows: the word bezos is in the feminine. Really, the pasuk should have said bezeh, because both a par and an ayil are masculine. So why does the Torah have to say bezos? Or the Torah could have written eila, these. But bezos is coming to teach me something more. Yes, it's coming legufe. It's coming to teach me that it is necessary for him to bring the ram and the bull as his sacrifices before he can come into the Kodesh HaKadoshim. But it's also coming to teach me something additional, which is to connect it to the Miluim. So now the Gemara asks another question. Okay, fine. You have this pasuk by Yom Kippur to connect Yom Kippur to the Miluim. Why did you need the additional pasuk by the Miluim, which talks about the two verbs, la'asos and lechaper? Mai va'omer. V'chite meyom ha'kippurim kamahu deboy prisha kedashchon b'miluim. Aval b'yom ha'kippurim da'al mala'o. Because you might have argued that if I just had the pasuk by Yom Kippur of bezos, I might have thought that the connection is as follows. Just like the very first day of Avoda required sequestration for 7 days, so too the very first Yom Kippur required sequestration for 7 days. But all future Yom Kippurs throughout history maybe did not. Inami Kohen Gadol Kamahu Deboy Prishval Kohen Gadol Ba'al Malo. Alternatively, maybe only the first Kohen Gadol Aharon, who's mentioned in the pasuk, he's the one that needs to be sequestered for 7 days, only so long as he's doing the avoda. But once he passes on and his descendants start doing the avoda, sequestration is no longer necessary, and therefore tashma kasher asa v'chuli. Therefore you need a gzera shava to connect the two for all of time. Okay, now that concludes the brisa that supports Rabbi Yochanan and the discussion of that brisa. Now we're going to go on to the other side with Reish Lakish. Tanya Kavase de Reish Lakish. The brisa now which supports Reish Lakish, who connects Yom Kippur to Maimed Har Sinai and not to the Miluim, says as follows: Moshe Allah ba'anan v'niskasa ba'anan v'niskadesh ba'anan kidei lekabel Torah liYisrael b'kedusha. That Moshe ascended Har Sinai in a cloud. He was covered in a cloud and sanctified in a cloud in order that he could receive the Torah for the Jewish people in a state of holiness. And how do you see this? Shenamar vayishkon kavod Hashem al Har Sinai zahayamaisa acher aseras hadibros shahayu techila la'arboim yom divrei Rabbi Yossi Haglili. The pasuk says, if you want to see the whole pasuk, it's in the Shmos Chaf Dalet. It says, "Vayishkon kavod Hashem al Har Sinai, vayichaseu he'anan sheishes yamim." That there was a cloud cover of a glory of God that covered Har Sinai in a cloud for 6 days. Vayikra el Moshe bayom hashvi mitoch he'anan, and God calls to Moshe from amidst the cloud on the 7th day. Now, according to Rabbi Yossi Haglili, this whole pasuk is taking place after the Jewish people have heard the Aseres Hadibros on Shavuos. After that event of them hearing the 10 Commandments, Moshe ascends Har Sinai, stands there in a sort of outside the cloud. There's a larger cloud that's covering the mountain, but the really deep, thick cloud is in the center, and Moshe stands atop Har Sinai waiting to be called in. He's sequestered for 6 days on top of Har Sinai, and then on the 7th day he's called in. And that marks the beginning of the 40 days that the Torah says, Vahi Moshe Bahar Arba'im Yom V'Arba'im Laila, that Moshe was atop the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. So this supports the position of Reish Lakish, that there was a sequestration for 6 days, and on the 7th day, God calls Moshe in to come into the Machaneh Shechina, into this divine camp like the Holy of Holies, in order to receive the Torah.
Does the math work then?
You're going to see. This whole Gemara today is about the math, so hold on to your hats. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Vayishkan Kvod Hashem Merosh Chodesh, and Rabbi Akiva disagrees. He says that this pasuk is not talking about what happened in the aftermath of the Ten Commandments, but rather as a prelude to the Ten Commandments. That when it says that the cloud of the glory of God covered in a cloud on Har Sinai, that begins on Rosh Chodesh, when Moshe and Bnei Yisrael are still at the foot of the mountain. Moshe is not yet on top of the mountain. There's no sequestration here. So according to Rabbi Akiva, you don't learn the laws of sequestration from this pasuk. And Vayechaseu he'anan lahar, that therefore when it says that the cloud covers the mountain, Vayikra el Moshe, and it says that God calls to Moshe, that's not God calling to Moshe after having been sequestered for 6 days, but rather that's Moshe v'chol Yisrael omdim, that God calls out to all of Klal Yisrael by announcing the Ten Commandments. That's the Vayikra el Moshe. Why does it then say Vayikra el Moshe if God is really calling out the Ten Commandments to all of Klal Yisrael? The answer is V'lo ba'a kasuv ela lechale kavod l'Moshe. The pasuk is only coming to give honor to Moshe Rabbeinu. Right, exactly. Okay? So therefore, you see from here that there's a machlokas as to whether you can learn like Reish Lakish or not. Reish Lakish is subscribing to Rabbi Yossi Haglili and not to Rabbi Akiva. Okay, Rabbi Nassan Omer. Now we have a third opinion in the Brisa. He says, Labo hakasuv elo lamarek achila u'shesiya shebemeyav lasumo kimalache hashares. The way that Rashi explains Rav Nassan Shita is that he also subscribes to Rabbi Yossi Haglili, that the sequestration was done after the Ten Commandments, that Moshe ascends the mountain and is sequestered for 6 days, and then God calls him in for the 7th day. However, that was a unique situation that cannot be the source text for any other halacha having to do with sequestration. Because this was a unique scenario where Moshe needed to literally ascend to heaven, and in order to be able to do that, he needed to remove any bodily matter, any physical matter from his body. So he needed 6 days in order to fully digest and remove all food that he had eaten before then from his body, and only on the 7th day could he be called up to Shamayim. So you cannot use this as a reference to Yom Kippur and what happens to the Kohen Gadol, because this was a unique situation. Only a person that's mamish ascending to Shamayim can actually be expected to do this. So the only point of disagreement between Rav Nassan and Rabbi Yossi Haglili is not the series of events, but why the series of events happened in the way that they happened. For Rabbi Yossi Haglili, it was because he was being called into the Machaneh Shechina by the cloud. But for Rabbi Nassan, it's because he's going up to Shamayim. And therefore you can't, for Rabbi Yossi Haglili, you can apply this to Yom Kippur. For Rabbi Nassan, you cannot. Rabbi Masya ben Charash Omer, Lo ba hakasuv elo la'ayem alav, kedei shetei Torah nitenes be'ema beresus uvezeya. He also sides with Rabbi Nassan and Rabbi Yossi Haglili that there was sequestration of Moshe for 6 days after the Ten Commandments, but he too also sides with Rabbi Nassan that this was a unique situation that cannot act as an exemplar for other cases. But not because of Rabbi Nassan's consideration of digesting food, but rather because since this was the giving of the Torah needs a unique kind of awe in order to receive the Torah properly. So Moshe had to go through 6 days of awesomeness in order to be able to go up to Shamayim to receive the Torah, because the Torah can only be given with awe, with fear, and with trepidation. Shenemar, as it says, Ivdu es Hashem b'yira v'gilu bir'ada. As the pasuk in Tehillim says, serve God with fear and rejoice with trepidation. Mai v'gilu bir ada. What do those words really mean? Rejoice with trepidation. Amar Rav Ada bar Masna, Amar Rav b'makom gilo sham tehera ada. That in the place of rejoicing, so there should be trepidation. The Torah represents rejoicing because it says Pekudei Hashem Yesharim Misamachei Lev, that the statutes of God cause the heart to rejoice. And therefore, when you study Torah, you're very happy. But at the same time, in order to receive them properly, you have to receive them with trepidation. So the Torah represents that paradox of emotion, and that's why Moshe needed to prepare for 6 days. Now, the Gemara asks the basic question, B'mai kamiflagi Rabbi Yossi Haglili v'Rabbi Akiva. What is really the machlokes between these two sages as to whether the 6 days described in the Pasuk happened before the 10 Commandments or after the 10 Commandments? It's based on the following machlokes that we learned before when we studied Maseches Shabbos together. We studied about a machlokes as to when the 10 Commandments were given. Were they given on the 6th of Sivan, or were they given on the 7th of Sivan? If you go back in your data banks to remember that machlokas, the Tanya, as the Brisa says, B'shisha b'chodesh nitna Torah l'Yisrael, Rabbi Yossi Omer b'shiva bo, that the Chachamim say the Torah was given on the 6th of Sivan. Rabbi Yossi, and please don't confuse Rabbi Yossi with Rabbi Yossi Haglili. They're two different people, as we'll see, that they don't agree with each other. Rabbi Yossi says the 10 Commandments were given on the 7th of Sivan. Man da'omer b'shisha nitna uv'shiva Allah. Now, if you learn that the 10 Commandments were given on the 6th day, that means that on the 7th day, Moshe waited until the following day in order to ascend to Har Sinai. Man da'omer b'shiva nitna uv'shiva Allah. And if you learn that the 10 Commandments were given on the 7th day, so on the self-same day, Moshe ascended. But both agree that Moshe ascended Har Sinai on the 7th of Sivan, and the reason why that you need to say that is because the math will only work out that the luchos were broken on the 17th of Tammuz if Moshe ascended Har Sinai on the 7th of Sivan. And we'll explain that shortly. Dichsiv vayikra el Moshe bayom hashvi'i. As it says, that God called to Moshe on the 7th day. So let's see, what is this machlokes? Rabbi Yossi Haglili Savar Lo Kitana Kama, Da'amar B'shisha B'chodesh Nitna Torah. So Rabbi Yossi Haglili looks at that pasuk and he says, look, I hold like the Chachamim who say that the 10 Commandments were announced on the 6th of Sivan. So Hilkach Zeh HaYomaisa Acher Aseres Adibros. And therefore, the only way that it could be that God calls to Moshe on the 7th day is if all of these events are taking place after the 10 Commandments. They can't be taking place before the 10 Commandments because God didn't call to Moshe and to Yisrael on the 7th day. He called to them on the 6th day to give them the Aseres Adibros.
You're saying that before, like when we were sort of halfway up of that they could still see it?
Hold on. So let me just explain it again. Rabbi Yossi Haglili says that these events of God calling to Moshe and Moshe staying for 6 days and then God calling to Moshe on the 7th day, that's taking place after the 10 Commandments were given. Moshe ascends the mountain, he's then sequestered for 6 days and God calls to him on the 7th day and he enters the thickness of the cloud. That's the way Rabbi Yossi Haglili understands it. The reason why he's forced to understand it that way is because you can't understand the words that God called to Moshe on the 7th day as referring to on the day that the 10 Commandments are being given, because it wasn't on the 7th day, it was on the 6th day. I don't know what you're referring to as far as the middle point of the mountain. We never talked about that.
Well, the 10 Commandments were given, I just can't remember that exact description of that event. Where was Moshe when the 10 Commandments were given?
Moshe seems to be somewhere not on the top of the mountain.
That's what I meant. Yeah.
Okay, he's not on the top of the mountain.
Right.
According to Rabbi Akiva, he's at the base of the mountain with the rest of the Jewish people, at least proximal to them in some way. He's nearby. So that's what's happening at the time of the 10 Commandments. Moshe is not on top of the mountain at this point, and he goes up to the mountain after the 10 Commandments are given. So again, we're looking at the pasuk of Vayikra el Moshe bayom hashvi. God calls to Moshe on the 7th day. According to Rabbi Yossi Haglili, it can only be happening afterwards, because if it's referring to the days before Matan Torah, since the 10 Commandments are on the 6th of Sivan, it can't be that God is calling to him on the 7th day. So Vayishkon Kvod Hashem al Har Sinai Vayechaseu He'enon Sheishas Yamim LeMoshe. Therefore, when the pasuk says that the glory of God rests on a cloud for 6 days, and that it covers for 6 days, it's covering Moshe Rabbeinu. Vayikra el Moshe Bayom Hashvi lekibulei Sha'ar Torah. And therefore, when God calls to Moshe on the 7th day, Moshe is already on top of Har Sinai. God is calling to him alone to enter the thickness of the cloud to receive the remainder of the Torah after the 10 Commandments. The Isal Gadaitich Vayishkon Kvod Hashem Merosh Chodesh Vayechaseu He'anon Lahar Vayikral Moshe Bayom Hashvi Lekubuli Aseres Hadibros. The other alternative is like Rabbi Akiva had suggested, that what it means is that the glory of God rests on the mountain starting from Rosh Chodesh. And when it says that God calls to Moshe on the 7th day, which was to receive the 10 Commandments, Hakabilu Luhu Mishisha V'Histalek Anan Mishisha. But that's not possible, because according to Rabbi Yossi Haglili, who holds like the Chachamim in the Machlokas and Shabbos, they already received the 10 Commandments on the 6th day. So it doesn't make sense for God to call to Moshe on the 7th day to give him the 10 Commandments. They got it a day before. The cloud had already, or the thickness of the cloud had already departed according to this, according to Rabbi Akiva.
Wasn't that oral, and then he's giving the actual luchos to Moshe?
The luchos come down on the 40th day. Moshe has to learn the Torah for 40 days, the remainder of the Torah, and come down with the luchos. So again, I don't want to overcomplicate the issue. But let's just simplify it as much as we can. It's impossible that this pasuk can be referring to what's the events preceding the 10 Commandments, because it says that the calling out was done on the 7th day. The 10 Commandments were given on the 6th day. So it's clearly not referring to the events leading up to the 10 Commandments, because then it should have said on the 6th day God calls out, not on the 7th day. Okay. The Rabbi Akiva Savar La Rabbi Yossi Da'amar B'Shiva B'Chodesh Nitna Torah L'Yisrael. Rabbi Akiva disagrees. He holds like Rabbi Yossi, and he says that the 10 Commandments are given to the Jewish people on the 7th of the month, on the 7th of Sivan, and therefore you explain the psukim as referring to events leading up to that Vayikra on the 7th day, that God calls out on the 7th day to announce the 10 Commandments. So that 7th day is the 7th of Sivan. The days leading up to that are the 6 days when the Jewish people are together with Moshe preparing for receiving the 10 Commandments. You learn no law of sequestration, therefore, according to Rabbi Akiva. Bishlam ala Rabbi Akiva, hainu de mishkachas la b'shivasar b'tamuz nishtabru haluchos, because Esrin v'arba desivan v'shitzer detamuz malaluhu arba and yomin dava bahar v'shivser betamuz nachis v'asa v'tavrina leluchos. So now the Gemara says, let's do the math now. This is what Alan was alluding to. According to Rabbi Akiva, it works out well, because we know we have a tradition that on the 17th of Tammuz, the luchos were broken by Moshe, 40 days after he had gone up to receive them. According to Rabbi Akiva, what happened? On the 7th of Sivan, Moshe goes up. These psukim of sequestration are not at all about sequestration, but rather the events leading up to the 10 Commandments. Therefore, Moshe goes up the mountain after the 10 Commandments, straight away, goes into the cloud to receive the remainder of the Torah. There's how many days remaining in Sivan? 24 days after the 7th. Including the 7th. How many days into Tammuz? 16. So 24 plus 16 is 40. So therefore, the day after the 40th day, he's coming down and he breaks the luchos on Shivas or B'Tammuz. Ella, the Rabbi Yossi Haglili, the Amar Shisha, the Prisha, the Arboim Dahar. But if you go like Rabbi Yossi Haglili, who says that there were 6 days of sequestration before Moshe entered into the cloud to receive the rest of the Torah, ad esrun utlas betamuz lo atbar luchos. Then if he needed 40 days in order to receive the remainder of the Torah, so then it turns out that he didn't go into the thickness of the cloud for those 40 days until 6 days or 7 days after the 6th. So he went into the thickness of the cloud on the 13th of Sivan. And if you do the math, 40 days afterwards would not be until the 23rd of Tammuz, not the 17th of Tammuz. So how do you get the math of the 40 days? So Amar Lecha Rabbi Yossi Haglili Arboin Dahar Bahadishisha Deprisha. Rabbi Yossi Haglili will answer that the 6 days of sequestration after the 10 Commandments are counted as part of the 40 days, which is a really interesting idea, because basically, according to Rabbi Yossi Haglili, not all 40 days that Moshe was on the mountain was he receiving or learning the Torah. 6 out of those 40 days were for the purpose of preparing, right? So it could even be a pedagogical discussion as well. What's the best way to educate a child? Is it to shtup him with as much information as possible, or to prepare him properly, right, for 6 days, and then to start shtupping him with information, right? So there's an interesting discussion here. Amar Mar. So let's go back to this whole discussion about the 10 Commandments and Moshe. Vayikra el Moshe, Moshe b'chol Yisrael omdim. So according to Rabbi Akiva, when the Torah says that God calls to Moshe, Moshe is not sequestered. Moshe, according to Rabbi Akiva, was with the rest of Bnei Yisrael. And when God calls to Moshe, it's really to announce the 10 Commandments to Moshe and to all of Klal Yisrael. So why then does it say that God only called to Moshe? Is to show special deference to Moshe Rabbeinu. Misayei le Rebbe Lazar, Dam Rebbe Lazar, Vayikra el Moshe, Moshe v'chol Yisrael omdim, v'lo ba'a kosav el lechalik lo kavod Moshe. It's only there, the pasuk only writes it as such to give special kavod to Moshe Rabbeinu. So Meisvei. Now let's raise a contradiction. There's another brisa that says kol lo, kol elav, Moshe shama v'chol Yisrael lo shama. That in the very first pasuk of Vayikra el Moshe, of Sefer Vayikra, the Torah says Vayikra el Moshe, and it also says, this is not actually the very first pasuk. This is in Bamidbar Perek Zayin. It says Vayishmas hakol midaber elav, that Moshe hears the voice speaking to him. And there, Chazal are very careful to say that because it doesn't say Vayishmas hakol midaber lo, but rather midaber elav, this teaches me that only Moshe could hear the voice of God calling out to him from the Ohel Moed, but no one else was able to hear the voice. It was only audible to Moshe, but to no one else. The question, therefore, is, how is it that you're learning the pasuk of Vayikra el Moshe as God speaking to Moshe, and all of Klal Yisrael hears it as well, whereas when it talks about Vayikra elav, or rather midaber elav, it says that only Moshe could hear and the rest of Klal Yisrael cannot hear. So which one is it? Lo kasha habasinai haba'ol mohed. So one answer, says the Gemara, is that it depends. The voice of God on top of Har Sinai was audible to all. It was a public experience. The voice of God calling to Moshe from the Ohel Moed was a private experience, and therefore only Moshe could hear the voice. The iba is ema lo kasha habakriya habadibur. Another answer is that look at the verbs in the pasuk. When it talks about calling Vayikra el Moshe on top of Har Sinai, the Vayikra is audible to everyone. That's a calling. When it's talking about speaking, then the voice or the sound is only audible to Moshe Rabbeinu. Rabbi Zreika Rami Kroi Kamei de Rabbi Lazar, Vamri La Amar Rabbi Zreika Rabbi Lazar Rami. So there's two versions as to who raised the contradiction in front of whom, but the point is that there's a steer in psukim. Ksiv v'lo yachol Moshe lavo el al moed ki shachan alav he'anan. At the very end of Sefer Shmos, it says that Moshe was unable to penetrate into the cloud, into the Mishkan, because the cloud filled the Mishkan. But Uchasiv Ayava Moshe b'soche anan. But an earlier pasuk says that Moshe came into the cloud. So how do you reconcile this? This teaches me that initially Moshe thought that the cloud was impenetrable. He says, how's there any way that I can come in here? But then Kavyachol, God grabs Moshe by the lapels and schleps him in. Meaning that sometimes you need God to pull you into a situation which seems to be impossible to penetrate. Devei Rabbi Yishmael Tana, Nemar kan besoch, v'nemar lahalan besoch, v'yavo b'nei Yisrael besoch hayam. Ma lahalan shvil, d'chsiv amayim lehem chayma, afkan shvil. That Devei Rabbi Yishmael connects it to the splitting of the Red Sea. How is it that the Jewish people were able to enter into the Red Sea? It was because God created a pathway for them to create a separation of water on either side. So too, even though Moshe looks at the cloud and he sees that it's impenetrable, But when God calls to him, God also created a pathway in the midst of the cloud to allow Moshe to enter in. Next, Vayikra el Moshe Vayidaber. This is the first pasuk of Sefer Vayikra. And it says that God calls to Moshe and God speaks to Moshe. The question that the Brisa asks is, Lama hiktim kriya l'dibor? Why does God first have to call to Moshe and only then speak to him? Limda Torah derech eretz shelo yomar adam davar lechavero ela imkein koreyu. Torah teaches us derech eretz. You should not speak to someone unless you first call him politely to attention. Meaning that you don't walk over to a person and say, "What time is it?" But rather, what do? You say, "Hi, Bob. What time is it?" You see, in other words, so that I haven't startled you by my speaking to you. I've prepared you for the experience of our conversation.
The right truck.
What?
Need the right truck. In other words, I emphasize it.
Yeah, right. So
is that the origins of the idea that you're supposed to knock on the door before you go in?
That's a good question. That actually is learned. We're going to learn that in Maseches YOMA, how we know that you're supposed to knock, and that's actually learned from the way the Kohen Gadol enters into the Holy of Holies. That it's why the Kohen Gadol wears bells on his clothing. We learn Derech Eretz from the Kohen Gadol as well, but that's a slightly different limud. But it's very similar. It's a very similar Derech Eretz kind of teaching. Misayei le Rabbi Chanina. This supports Rabbi Chanina. Damar Rabbi Chanina lo yomar adam davar lechavero elim kein koreu. That a person should not say something to his friend unless he first, welcomes him or calls him by name. Now, what is the word lamor? That Vayikrel Moshe Vayidaber Hashem elav me'ohel moed lamor. So Amar Rebbe Menasya bar Berei de Rebbe Menasya Mishmei de Rebbe Menasya Rabba Minayin la Omer Davar lechaver shehu beval yoimar ad sheyomar lo lech emor shenemar vayidaber Hashem elav me'ol moed lemor. So how do we know that a person who is told by if my friend tells me something, I'm not allowed to repeat that information to someone else unless my friend expressly gives me permission to do so? In other words, you have to assume that any information that you receive from a friend is confidential until he tells you otherwise. And how do you know this? Because of the word lamor. Now, Rashi has a very interesting way of seeing this. He says that the word lamor is a contraction of two words. Lo emor. Do not speak. I would have, without Rashi, lule de mistafina, I think that there's another way of learning this Gemara. The extra word lamor means that God gave Moshe express permission to repeat it to Bnei Israel. If the Torah would have only said Vayikral Moshe Vayidaber Hashem elav me'ol moed, then Moshe would not have necessarily known that it was permitted for him to go and repeat this information to Bnei Israel. The extra word lamor means that God made it clear to him that he wanted to repeat this information to Bnei Israel.
So it's just the opposite.
So it's just the opposite of Rashi. Yes.
The word lamor does mean to give over to somebody else.
Right.
Precisely.
It's after this limud. But Rashi, strangely enough, and it's a little sarachian on Rashi. Rashi, strangely enough, learns differently. Rashi learns that the word lamor is lo emor. Do not say this over until I give you express permission.
Maybe unless it's together, lamor. If it's separate, it's layamar. If it's one word,
sometimes
maybe
it
that's
says
what
lamor.
it means.
It says daber b'nei Yisrael v'amarta. So
right.
Why does it say it again?
Yeah. I didn't have a chance to look around in the Marsha. Maybe the Marsha says something. I don't remember. Okay. Michlal. So now the Gemara goes back to our a discussion that we had yesterday. If you recall, there was a conversation, a dialogue between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Rabbi Yochanan says, I learned the law of sequestration of 7 days from the laws of the Miluim. Reish Lakish challenges him. Reish Lakish says, if you're learning it from the Miluim, we know that by the Miluim, every single protocol was ma'akev, which means that if you didn't do it exactly the way the Torah prescribed, the avoda was not valid. Are you going to suggest the same thing for the sequestration of the avoda for Yom Kippur? That if you don't sequester the Kohen Gadol for 7 days, then he cannot do the avoda on Yom Kippur? And Rabbi Yochanan says, yeah, Taka, that's how I'm going to learn. Reish Lakish says, but what about the understudy Kohen Gadol? He doesn't have to be sequestered. Right? So that was the way that we left the challenge to Rabbi Yochanan. And Rabbi Yochanan then turns to Reish Lakish and says, okay, where's your source text if you're not learning it out from the Miluim? But we never answered really that issue. But it seems like Rabbi Yochanan was conceding to Reish Lakish that just like by the Miluim, every protocol is Ma'akev, so too by Yom Kippur, every protocol, including sequestration, is Ma'akev. So the Gemara says, based on that whole discussion, Michlal de Teravayo Svirlu Miluim Kol HaKosu Behen Ma'akev Bahen. It seems like both Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish are of the opinion that every protocol that's mentioned by the Miluim is li'ikuva. It means that it has to be done just that way, and if not, you can't commence. The itmar. But we have a machlokus on this issue, because the machlokus is as follows. Miluim, Rabbi Yochanan v'Rabbi Chanina. We have a machlokus between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Chanina. Chad Omer kol hakasav ben ma'akev bahen, v'chad Omer davar ma'akev l'doros ma'akev bahen, she'ein ma'akev l'doros ein ma'akev bahen. That one of the two says that every protocol mentioned by the Miluim is li'ikuva, and the other one says no, only those protocols that are perennial, that would apply for future generations, were li'ikuva, meaning they had to be done, and if not, the avoda would not be kosher. But if there were specific, unique protocols that only pertain to the Miluim, and they were not done just so, the avoda was still kosher. Tistayim to Rabbi Yochanan who da'amar kol hakasav ben ma'akev bahen mid'kamar le Reb Shimon ben Lakish to Rabbi Yochanan imam Miluim kol hakasav ben ma'akev bahen v'lo kamahadr le v'lo midi. Let's assume that Rabbi Yochanan is of the opinion in this machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Chanina, where it's not identified who holds what, but it would seem that Rabbi Yochanan is the one who holds that every protocol by the Miluim, regardless of whether it was a one-time protocol or a perennial protocol, was li'ikuva, because Reish Lakish challenges Rabbi Yochanan based on the fact that the sequestration, which is a one-time protocol by the Miluim, was li'ikuva, and Rabbi Yochanan didn't counter that argument. So it seems like he concedes to that argument that the sequestration by the Miluim is li'ikuva. So the Gemara says, Tistayim. You're right, that's a good proof, and therefore we see that Rabbi Yochanan held that every single protocol by the Miluim was li'ikuva, was needed to be done just that way, and if not, the avoda would not be kosher. But now the question is, which protocols were Lidoros, and which protocols were unique to the Miluim? That we haven't yet defined, and the Gemara is going to tell us tomorrow, Mirz Hashem, what those protocols were. Have a wonderful day.